Hello and welcome to the 7th lecture on true Dhamma, following in the footsteps of the Buddha. This week is about the historic practices and the second part of the environmental lecture and the cultural lecture about ancient Buddhism, or how the culture worked back then. Last time we were doing a lot of content on the Buddha as a person, some of the important people that played a major role back then, some of the historic settings, and we also had a story time. This time around, we do a lot of other things. We try to analyze why suttas are the way they are. We try to analyze the structure of the teachings, or why the Buddha chose to teach in a certain way. And we analyze some of the aspects when it comes to translations and traditions. In the end, we have a short summary. But anyway, let us begin. And as always, if you wish to, you can practice 5 minutes of emotional non-reactivity, or mindfulness, or virtue, however you want to call it, if you want to make the entire lecture a bit more enjoyable for you. I will obviously not wait for 5 minutes, but you can pause the video and then continue after 5 minutes of non-reactivity. I will just assume that you are done now and continue with the content of the lecture. So, let us now come to the historic practices. And this might be a big surprise to many of the modern practitioners. At least those who start with meditation usually start with a book that is much more modern than any of the ancient texts. And from those modern books, they typically pick up 1 or 2 meditation methods. They practice them for a while, get more into it, and maybe start reading the Suttas, or the ancient texts. And then there might be a big surprise in for them, like it was for me, because I never found any of the meditation methods that are nowadays taught in the Suttas. Nothing. And this surprised me a lot. And the reason for that is, and after a long while of studying literally everything of the ancient texts that I could get my hands on, I found out that formal meditation methods simply did not exist. They did not exist in the way that they existed today. When the Buddha said monks should do their meditation, he was very much referring to very specific practices of, for example, samadhi, or we will analyze that later. It means keeping things together, or composure. Then he was pretty much advising them to spend time in a temporary liberated state of mind, which is not something that most of us can simply do. So when people were practicing, their main methods were practically practicing non-sensuality, or virtue, or sense restraint, or such things. This is something that you can do pretty much at any given time. And people were busy back then. So people mainly were farmers, as we analyzed in the last lecture. So a lot of the effort went into just sustaining their lives and just producing food and everything else that is necessary. And yeah, this is kind of problematic. So when you want to spend a lot of time on a meditation cushion like now, or spend some time in a retreat like right now, then that's not really possible. At least it was not possible for the vast majority of people. So in that time, it was more or less a necessity to become a monk if you wanted to practice the Dhamma sufficiently for full liberation. This has changed nowadays. Nowadays, as a householder, you can actually get enough time to practice sufficiently for full liberation. And it's very much possible to become an arahant as a layperson. This was not really an option, except you were a king or something like that back in the days. The question of the lay arahant is never really answered in the Pali Canon, but if you are perfectly honest, the only thing that you have to do is not to live like a householder, to be not engaging in sensuality all the time, to be not enchanted by sensuality, to be not driven by lust and hatred. And that is possible as a householder, given suitable external conditions. So you can actually do that. You can actually progress quite far in the Dhamma if you choose to. But you cannot live like a householder. You pretty much have to live like a monk without the official title. There is no magic attached to the title of monkhood. It is in your behavior. And this is very important to keep in mind. Further, there were some practices that are like the absorption jhanas that are often taught in the Visuddhimagga. But the Buddha very much criticized people for practicing them. And there were people who tried to ignore everything that was unpleasant, like to focus just on something pleasant and shut out everything else. That was something that was practiced back then. And the Buddha called it over-meditation, under-meditation, and mis-meditation. He even compared people who practiced like that to a blind or a deaf person and said, yeah, if it was about ignoring parts of your experience, then a blind or a deaf person must surely be enlightened, but they are not. They are most of the time suffering greatly from their condition. And he also compared meditators who practice like that with predatory animals who were just watching one spot, and getting nothing out of it. He kind of mocked them for such styles of meditation. So when it comes to liberation, the actual liberation from sufferings that are independent of the circumstances, then those styles of meditation were very much criticized by the Buddha. It does not mean that there is no merit to such methods. The only thing that means is that they are kind of perpendicular to the actual real training in the Dhamma. And people nowadays have a very hard time accepting that because those practices feel very good. But when you are very careful in reading the suttas, then you realize that many of the suttas actually talk about not being touched by any kind of feeling. Not being touched by good feelings, not being touched by bad feelings, not being touched by neutral feelings. A noble person experiences all those feelings detached. He is not touched by them. And the pleasure, or the happiness that the Buddha described, is a happiness of relief. You are no longer touched by those things. You are no longer pushed and pulled around by them. This is why you are liberated. He called it liberation most of all, and not really awakening or enlightenment. He also called it like that. But most of the time he spoke about the liberation from the body, the liberation from the mind, so that you do no longer have to suffer with the body or with the mind. And yeah, virtue was common back then to tame the mind. It was more or less the main method. You practiced yourself in emotional non-reactivity. You practice yourself in not giving in to your emotional impulses of wanting something to go away or wanting to distract yourself. And ascetics also pondered and discussed a lot. So this is the second most common type of practice back then. When you could not yet spend time in non-reactivity or spend time in a semi-liberated state of mind, then you discussed with other ascetics who were more advanced than you. And you pondered the meaning of certain words. You had to understand the first jhana to enter the first jhana, as an example. Because you cannot really make sure that you are there unless you understand what it is. You cannot identify a Toyota Honda car if you don't know what it is. You have to have a rough idea of what that might be before you can actually identify what it is. And in the same way, you can only really, diagnose the first jhana once you have sufficiently understood what it is. And the difficult thing is that the Buddha, for example, described at least 6 or 7 states before the first jhana that feel very good. So which of those is the first jhana? None. Those feelings that the Buddha described as very good when it comes to the first jhana, he always attributed to the seclusion from unwholesome states. It is a pleasure of seclusion, not the pleasure of the first jhana, which is always something that is, mistranslated or simply misrepresented. So when people discussed and pondered a lot, it was always with the idea to get a better understanding of what was going on, of all the words that the Buddha used, of all the concepts he used for teachings. And they also practiced self-interrogations and discussions to reveal misunderstandings. On your own, you are very limited. You can't really figure out what is wrong, as an example. It's more like having a scientific debate. It is there so you can reveal your blind spots. You can reveal your misunderstandings. It's a bit like being questioned by a teacher. When you are just sitting passively in the audience, it's an entirely different thing as if the lecturer is asking you something to check your understanding. Suddenly it is a matter of vital concern, and you will learn with an entirely different attitude. And contemplations to understand and gain insight were also very common. In this case, contemplation just means that you dwell on a topic. You are sitting there and trying to figure out what, for example, is the first jhana, or what does this non-self that the Buddha is talking about all the time means. And this is also something that is very interesting. When you look at videos or Dhamma talks online, most of the time they are not about Dhamma. And the problem is you need an understanding of Dhamma to actually identify what Dhamma talks or what Dhamma talks concerning Dhamma are, which is also very important. And most of those talks are not about Dhamma. They are about enjoying yourself in a slightly different way. which is, again, it's not really a bad thing, but it's not Dhamma, and it's not good to call it Dhamma. It's talk about virtue. And when it comes to jhana, which is one of the main, well, let's call it methods that the Buddha used, then we have to make sure that the modern jhanas are very much not like the ancient jhanas. So the jhana practice that the Buddha described was always a state of awakening. When the Buddha explains those states, he calls them, all the jhanas, either the imperturbable or the a temporary liberation of mind. Those were words that he used. And people who practice another kind of jhana usually ignore all those explanations of jhana that does not suit them, that does not fit into the image of jhana. You are not really liberated when you can still suffer. You are not liberated regardless of the situation when you only are free from suffering on the meditation cushion, when you are in this deeply absorbed state. I mean, this is just a pleasant abiding, which is fine. You can have pleasant abidings, but you should not mistake them with Dhamma or with awakening or liberation. So this is very important to keep in mind. And jhana, this is also something that is usually ignored, was the last element on the Noble Eightfold Path shortly before awakening. So the Noble Eightfold Path starts with right view, and right view is a synonym for stream entry. So the entire Dhamma starts, again, I think I have said that many times before, but the entire Dhamma starts with stream entry. Before that, you are practicing virtue. It is completely necessary, it is absolutely crucial to do that, but it is not yet the Dhamma. The Dhamma means the nature of all things, and unless you have seen the nature of all things, namely the three marks, directly in your experience, so that it makes an earth-shattering difference, then you are not practicing the Dhamma. So many people nowadays try to soften all the transition points, or they are saying that it is enough to practice like that. But that's not true. The only real threshold is the understanding of the Dhamma, namely attaining of right view. So, yeah, that's very important to keep in mind. And wrong jhanas did exist. Again, Buddha called it mismeditation, over-meditation, and under-meditation. And meditation for good feelings, he was very much criticizing. He called it meditating with your sensuality, which is not a good thing. Again, you try to be immune to the domain of the senses. You try to be liberated from the senses, liberated from the body. You no longer want to be independent on good feelings. And this is also very important. Good feelings before jhana were usually due to virtue. Or, as an example, we have a lot more on that later in chapter 5, where we talk about the entire virtue chapter. Many of those feelings are due to non-remorse, or joy, or bodily calm, or any of those states. Those are very pleasant states, and they are all accompanied by the practice of Dhamma, but they are not the Dhamma. This is very, very important. We should make very clear what is Dhamma and what is not Dhamma, because otherwise people mix up non-Dhamma with Dhamma and Dhamma with non-Dhamma, and this is not a good thing, because it really makes it very confusing for new practitioners to find out what the entire core or heartwood of the training is. The Buddha gave many similes when it comes to that. He was very keen on the fact that some things are the heartwood of the Dhamma, the heartwood of the practice, and some things are just the bark, the outer bark, the inner bark, the sapwood, or anything like that. So virtue might be comparable with the bark or the sapwood of a tree, and not with the heartwood. The Dhamma is the heartwood. And some people want to get the Dhamma, want to get the heartwood, seek out to get heartwood, but in the end, not understanding what Dhamma is, they just take the sapwood of a tree and rejoice in it and think that it is Dhamma, but it is not. And they will realize when they are faced with true hardship in their lives, namely with deadly suffering or death. This is very often happened in the Suttas, that monks thought they were liberated, but when death drew near, they realized their mistakes and renewed their efforts, and sometimes it worked, and they became arahants, so they were not reborn. But anyway, let us continue. Let us now try to understand why suttas are the way they are, because to new readers, they can seem very cryptic. And again, a lot of that can be attributed to the different culture, but we will soon understand that. So the teaching background is very important. And the Buddha, as a spiritual teacher, was probably the most pragmatic of all teachers. He only focused on suffering and how to stop it. This is also very important. Buddhism is about removing suffering and not about some unity with I don't know, a deity or a god or reclaiming eternal parts of your soul or something like that. It is literally about suffering and how to stop it. And the current multitude of methods, as an example, is very new. The Buddha really focused on the essentials of the holy life, as he called it, and never really went into specifics, because specifics are not really necessary for that. You can be very specific in what you do, and you will be very specific in what you do, but those things cannot be generalized for many people. So you have to, as a teacher, make sure that your teachings stand the test of time. So if you would give very specific instructions, and the Buddha also gave a sutta on that, where Buddhas of the past were just reading the minds of their pupils, then you might give very good instructions to them, but they are of little use when it comes to new practitioners in the future. And it's also very important to keep in mind that basically all the suttas aim at the very same thing. They differ in wording in terms of the background of the listener, but overall they all point to the very same thing. The Buddha really did only teach two things, namely suffering and how to stop it. And every single sutta is directed at that in one way or another. There are suttas that are for very early practitioners, where the Buddha mainly teaches virtue, because those people were not ready for more. But overall, basically all suttas were for the direct overcoming of suffering. And sometimes he was also teaching for larger groups, and he had to be more general, even more general than normally, and he gave more complete discourses sometimes too, simply to catch every listener. So when there are large groups of people and you cannot really judge the background of those people, then you pretty much have to go very much into detail so that everyone understands and the shortcomings of everyone are addressed. This is, for example, why lectures at university are in so much detail. At least if they are good lectures. There are some listeners who would not need that, but there are also listeners who do need that. For them, it might even be the case that the instructions are not detailed enough. And at the time of the Buddha, people usually only heard 1 or 2 suttas, and that had to be enough. He was a wandering monk. Unless you were a monk too and traveling with the Buddha or one of his disciples, then you were not fortunate enough to hear more than those 1 or 2 suttas. And those suttas were often enough for people to either attain stream entry or even to reach the stage of anagami shortly before becoming an arahant, a fully enlightened being. And those suttas were always enough. There was no large database or online storage of suttas. The access was not what we have today. We are very fortunate that we have the entire Pali Canon now. And the current extreme sutta access is very new and not strictly necessary. Or as Ayya Khema used to say, all you have to do is understand one sutta in absolute detail, and then you become liberated. Again, there is this one sutta about brushing your teeth, which might not be among those that I'm designating right now. But overall, nearly 99% of suttas can serve as a basis for full liberation. And if people try to understand them in any different context from that, then they are making a grave mistake, in my opinion, because then they are taking the sapwood of the holy life and not the hardwood. Then they are not attaining the Dhamma, then they are just doing something else. And the Buddha was always focusing on those people where the likelihood of success or establishing the teachings were the highest. So he started with those people who were the most progressed. And he really wanted to start with his 2 prior teachers, with Kalama and Ramaputta, if I remember their names correctly. I'm always forgetting them. I'm not very good with the Indian names. And sadly those were dead. So he started with a group of 5 ascetics he was spending a lot of time with, because they were also very advanced, very restrained, very virtuous. So they had a fertile ground for understanding the Dhamma. They fulfilled all the preconditions. So he went there, started teaching them, then they understood the Dhamma, and based on that, they could help him establish the Dhamma, because now the Buddha had some kind of reputation, because it worked with other people. So he always started with very easy targets, and then they assisted him in teaching other people. And those trainees already had supreme virtue. They had years of prior training often. It is not that some monks were very fortunate for hearing that one sutta that liberated you in an instant. It is that they are fortunate that they did all the moral training before. They pretty much uprooted the entirety of sensuality beforehand. So all they needed was a short phrase of the Buddha, some short utterance of another to understand fully and to become liberated by wisdom. Well, overall, people are kind of envious of such situations nowadays. And most of the time they are not putting in the work, which is also very important to keep in mind. But yeah. And overall, they needed a little advice, or often very general advice, because they were progressed enough. They did not need anything like that. And it happened really often that listeners attained stream entry or sometimes even nibbana while listening. And this is also something that seems completely foreign to many practitioners of modern meditation methods, because for them, it is all about sitting on the meditation cushion and about some experience that you have during meditation, which is not the case for all those people who are practicing the true Dhamma, who are very much independent of the circumstances, free from suffering. So you don't have to meditate in any special way, which is also something that we analyze in chapter 6 greatly, or in great detail. Because at that point, one of the fetters, or all the three fetters fall off at once, that we will also analyze in detail, but one of those fetters is an attachment to rites and rituals, or to virtue and duty. You can translate it in different ways, but it contains the word sila, the word the Buddha used, which means virtue. So at that point you transcend virtue, you transcend methods. And it will be crystal clear why methods are superficial, why they are gratuitous, why you don't really need them. If that is not crystal clear to you, then it might very well be that your stream entry that you think of is not the actual stream entry. This is also very important to keep in mind. And again, awakening is not magical. It is not handed to you. It is due to your own efforts at understanding, due to your own efforts at removing your dependence on the sensual domain. This is very important to keep in mind. It is not an experience that just happens if you sit on the cushion. It is an understanding. The Buddha used nothing more in the entire Pali Canon, as we have seen in the pie chart that I presented in the last chapter, than the word wisdom or anything related to wisdom. It is the core of the Dhamma. And the Buddha also used very general methods. He only taught general methods, in fact, with many, many repetitions. Those really helped the listeners to understand and really grasp what he was talking about. And it was custom to answer any question when asked 3 times, which is also interesting. The Buddha usually limited himself to answering questions when he thought they were beneficial to the listeners. But sometimes people insisted on getting an answer from the Buddha, and then they had to ask 3 times. He did not go into a lot of details or state milestones. Well, he gave some milestones, namely the milestones of Sotapaddi, Sakadagami, Anagami, and Arahantship. But apart from that, there were no real step-by-step style recipe approaches that are comparable with cooking recipes that we want nowadays. We are very much accustomed to following such recipes. We can see that all the time in studying computer science. The most successful languages that appeal the most to people are imperative languages that are very much like a recipe that you step-by-step work off. Those recursive languages that are more functional, but in my opinion, much more suitable for many problems. Those are not very well received in most cases, because they deviate from this cookbook style approach. And methods like, the problem is that the environment changes a lot. For example, if you think about cooking recipes, stoves, ingredients, tools, and everything else are very different everywhere around the earth, even nowadays. Are you talking about an earthen oven, about a high modern microwave, just a standard oven or whatever? It is not clear, at least if you are trying to reach as many people as possible. And recipes like saute until golden brown or season to taste or cook until soft are a lot better than cook for 21.5 minutes on setting 4, because such an instruction might be very helpful for a very specific person. But in general, it's not very helpful. And this is what many of the methods nowadays fall for when it comes to fallacies, in my opinion, because they are only reaching a very tiny minority of people that are missing exactly that tiny piece of the puzzle, while they are completely missing the bigger picture. And many other people are not profiting at all. I know, for example, people who practice the Mahasi Sayadaw style of noting or labeling meditation for 20 years and never got anything out of it. So it's completely unsuitable for them. Those methods are not universal universally applicable. And the Buddha was very keen on not saying something that is not universally of benefit. So such instructions that the Buddha gave can provably last thousands of years, because we still have them and we can still apply them, because fundamentally the process of learning and understanding has not changed. It's still the same. We learn with the same mind when it comes to adding numbers, or learning to move as a baby, or learning to meditate. It's fundamentally not different. Just the topic of understanding changes. We try to understand the nature of things and no longer the specifics. And the Buddha also did some branching out. When advanced trainees got, rare in Buddhism, then he targeted another audience. Initially, people only needed some encouragement to be more mindful. This is all they needed. The Buddha really complained at some point that in the beginning, everyone only needed to rouse some roused mindfulness. But after some time, he had to do a lot more. For example, he had to lay down a code of conduct years later, because people started misbehaving gravely. And people who were less and less suitable for the holy life, but still had the potential, were starting to become monks. And after a time, he created the order of nuns after some convincing of Ananda. And this was a major step in society where women were regarded as unfit. The first female lay followers became much, much earlier, and they were also practicing very good Buddhism, as an example, or the Dhamma, as the Buddha called it. The Buddha never called it Buddhism, he called it the Dhamma, which makes sense. Why would you ever name something after yourself? That's something that people after your death typically do. And after that, the Buddha also started teaching lay people. Initially, he did not do that, because their conditions were not really suitable. Only after the Dhamma was sufficiently established did he start to teach all those people where the chances of success were much smaller. So he focused on those where the chances were best first, simply because the probability of establishing good teachings are much, much higher. And the Buddha used fitting similes and detailed discourses for beginners too. So when he spoke to a farmer, he used farming similes. When he spoke to a fire ascetic, he gave the fire sermon. He always took the knowledge that people had and molded them accordingly so that people could understand the Dhamma based on that. So in the beginning, only the most advanced practitioners, and later, first the order of nuns, then lay people, and sometimes he was also teaching rebellious or cruel youth some lessons when they were torturing animals, depending on the situation. But anyway, let us now come to the structure of the teaching, which is also very important and something that should help us understand the suttas, should we try to really start reading them on our own. So first of all, mainly the suttas in the Pali Canon were given to advanced practitioners, to people who were already stream enterers. Whenever you read the word noble, Aryan, right view, or something like that, the sutta is very advanced. Those words always refer to people who have at least attained the first stage of awakening. There is little value for beginners without help in understanding them. You should start with suttas that are applicable for your situation, and some will resonate better with you than others. For example, the Satipatthana Sutta is very difficult to understand. It was directed at pretty much only stream enterers, and nowadays it is used as instructions for beginners when it comes to meditation. This might be a problem. There is still merit in trying to understand very difficult suttas that are beyond your scope of understanding, because that is how we understand. We confront ourselves with the material that we don't understand and try to understand it, so we do understand it. But still, we need a good foundation of other things before we attempt that. We cannot start with a sutta that is very advanced. Well, we can, but we will mainly earn frustration. So we should make sure that we have a solid foundation of virtue, a solid foundation of non-craving, because otherwise we only understand based on our craving, through our craving, and this is a problem. We can never end up at the Dhamma when we try to understand with craving. We have to weaken our craving beforehand so that we can actually make a breakthrough through the Dhamma. And suttas become very useful after stream entry because they can speed up your progress tremendously. That is their purpose. Those people who attain stream entry have fundamentally understood everything that they must do. They have understood craving as the source of suffering and what you must do to never suffer again, not just on the meditation cushion, but ever. And you will You will understand why it is called a liberation, why you escape the body, why you escape the mind, or whatever simile the Buddha used, or whatever way of phrasing. And reading most suttas before stream entry can be very frustrating, but it is necessary at some point. You have to do it to understand the Dhamma. You have to try to understand the Dhamma to understand the Dhamma. And a lot of the repetition is very intentional. It's like learning for university. We also repeat all the time until it is second nature. You drill it, you train it. It's a gradual training. It requires repetition because that is simply the way how humans learn. And we cannot really avoid that. And again, it's very important to keep in mind that an effort at understanding advanced suttas is very good for you, but only on the basis of sufficient reduced craving. Otherwise, it will not work. It cannot work. It is quite literally impossible. If you have very strong craving, you can only understand through your craving. And understanding through your craving usually means that you understand things in terms of wanting more pleasure, or wanting to avoid pain, or wanting to distract yourself. And that is not an understanding when it comes to Dhamma. Dhamma goes beyond that. And now a few words on philosophy or speculation. The Buddha never taught any philosophy. He even refused to answer speculative questions or questions that pertained to philosophy. There were many people who just went under the Buddha to get answers to their speculative questions, and those were complaining to the Buddha because he never answered them. And they threatened that they will leave his dispensation, and the Buddha always said, "Yeah, but I have not asked you to be here. If you don't want to practice the Dhamma, then don't be here." Those were pretty much his words. I can only, recite them from memory and not in the literal term. But yeah, those speculative questions almost universally are based on wrong assumptions. I have no real good way to explain that to you, but they always presuppose something that was not true, and then we're asking questions based on that. A lot of the time, people based their question on an assumed personhood, on an assumed self. The Buddha always taught non-self. He always said, no, I can't find any self. There is probably no sense of self that is mine. Well, I can't find any of that. There is, for practical purposes, not self is true. And yeah, due to those wrong assumptions, you cannot answer those questions in a satisfying way for a person. If you have someone who assumes that the world is flat, he will have that assumption woven into everything that he does or thinks. It is not possible. If you are referring to the earth, it's flat for them and it's round for you. And in the same way, those speculative questions are, based on a wrong assumption. And from a wrong assumption, everything can follow, as we understood in chapter 0, where we went through the basics of logic as an example. And those questions were pretty much always unskillful in the sense that they are not leading to Nibbana. And there are typically at least 10 unanswered questions that were of lots of philosophical interest at the time of the Buddha that he never answered. And all of them are based on a false assumption of a self. And he only really taught how to end suffering, all the preliminary steps, in pretty much every single sutta. And he refused to do anything else. In that case, he was absolutely pragmatic. Anything else likely does not date back to the Buddha. So when you find a sutta that does something else than that, then you can pretty much be sure that it's not from the Buddha and not from the earliest texts. So, for example, reading the Jatakas, the birth stories of the Buddha, they are completely different in style when it comes to anything that is from the Pali Canon. They are impractical. Those are more nighttime stories for children or anything like that, or some entertaining stories, but really not Dhamma. But yeah. And also it is important to keep in mind that we had a verbal culture at the time of the Buddha. There were no books around 2,600 years ago, and all the suttas were transmitted verbally by simple memorizing them for about 300 years. And people had vastly better memories back then because they had to. Right now, we can't sometimes remember single things, and it seems like our capacity to remember and learn is always declining. And that is true because we have so many tools that rob us of the challenges that are necessary to develop such skills. Without such skills, it is impossible to really remember such a vast collection of suttas. But people back then did that. For example, Ananda, as I already named in the last lecture, had an eidetic memory. He could pretty much remember everything, like Warren Buffett nowadays. He has a quasi-eidetic memory where he can pretty much just look at a page and know and memorize what is in there. There are people like that out there. And there are also some remarks necessary on the order of the suttas. The spoken order is usually the order in which you should practice. The numbering schemes were mere memory aids, so the 4 foundations of mindfulness are not to be practiced in the order that they are listed, and the 7 factors of awakening, or the 37 aids to awakening, or anything like that. They should not be practiced in that order. Those are just memory aids for people to actually understand and remember the essentials of the holy life. And there were people in the time of the Buddha that remembered 10,000 or more pages of the books we have nowadays, namely Ananda, who was questioned, by the way, at the Arahant Summit, where those teachings were collected and streamlined for all the other monks. So they were spending several months where Ananda did nothing but reciting the suttas as he had heard them from the Buddha, including the locations, including the people, including the circumstances, because those are all very important. This is why there was always a location at the beginning of the sutta. It always starts with at that time, the Blessed One was dwelling in Savatthi, Jeta's Grove, or something like that. So that the context is very clear and the culture is very clear, because otherwise you cannot really understand the content of the suttas. You cannot understand or make sense of the similes that the Buddha used, because he always, adjusted the teachings for the target audience. And after a while, after about 300 years or 500 years, we have suddenly a fixed point where people started writing down Dhamma in books. And they emerged in Sri Lanka roughly 500 years after the Buddha's parinibbana. So from that point onwards, we have no more changes that might have sneaked in to the Pali Canon due to wrong remembering or something like that. Additional changes became very unlikely, and we have those source texts still available. And only 300 or more years after the Buddha's parinibbana, all this happens, or the intent started to manifest to write those things down, because then books were available, because vast parts of India have been invaded by Greece. I think Alexander the Great might have done that during that time. And which was a very important time. And this is more or less the reason why we have still good Dhamma, true Dhamma today. And the suttas from the Pali Canon, as an example, are internally so consistent that any additional changes are very unlikely, because they all state more or less the same thing. They are extremely logical, they are pretty much always testable, and very likely true to what the Buddha originally taught. At least people can make a breakthrough to the Dhamma based on that. And they are written in an unused language or dialect, namely in Pali, and usually not in Sanskrit. And they are a very good starting point for retranslations. And retranslating is a very good thing. We try to, from a computer science perspective, try to avoid translating translations, because this will just add error upon error upon error. If we always translate from the initial source text, there's a very limited possibility for error. So we avoid those additive or even multiplicative errors, and have always a good, fresh book we can start with, which is a very great gift, if you ask me. And now to the last content chapter for today, namely towards translations and traditions, and a few words on those. And here is a small problem repetition. There are many, in my opinion, problems with many major traditions of Buddhism nowadays. For example, the Theravada tradition totally gets dependent origination wrong, which is the one teaching special to the Buddha, as the Buddha said himself. And they mainly rely on an interpretation from the Visuddhimagga book, which completely butchers the interpretation of dependent origination, which is the core piece, the single insight that is absolutely necessary to understand the Dhamma. And the Theravada absorption jhanas are also wrong, namely the concentration practices as displayed by the book Visuddhimagga. And I'm trying to highlight here why it might be a problem to rely on newer sources, or on sources that are not in line with the suttas. Because in many cases, those newer commentarial texts or books misrepresent the Buddhas. They are contradicting what is being taught in the original source texts. And just to name another tradition, it's obviously not true for every Mahayanist or every Theravada Buddhist. There are very good exceptions who rely more on the suttas and not on the more modern texts. But Mahayana also gets the concept of impermanence wrong and makes it less personal and much more into something that is in objective flux or something like that, which is the exact opposite from what the Buddha taught. And the Buddha always said that the Dhamma should be like an open hand and not a closed fist. Yet, many of the newer traditions rely on so-called revelations, where they invent new suttas and say, no, at that point in time the Buddha was lying and the real teachings were just reserved for his real followers or something like that, which is also in stark contrast to that statement that the Buddha made, that the Dhamma should be open. He was not leaving out anything for any special person or something like that. He was teaching all of it. He was just teaching two things in every single sutta, namely suffering and how to stop it. And yeah, also it happens that there are countless word problems with multiple meanings nowadays. So when we translate the word virtue or moral or something like that, then we can be sure that it's mainly misunderstood through the lenses of Christianity, where morality and virtue meant something different than when it comes to Buddhism. And virtue in general is gravely misrepresented anyway, mainly due to that problem. And yeah, many modern practices are much more about management of suffering than about overcoming suffering. Those terms are often confused. When you reduce your suffering, that is not the same as uprooting it. The Buddha was about uprooting suffering so that it cannot arise again and not making it go away when it is there. This is coping. And the Dhamma is not about coping. The Dhamma removes the root cause of the problem by understanding it. And modern traditions often rely on those commentarial texts. And those commentarial texts are often in a very stark contradiction with the suttas. And they have been created much, much later. And now we have a problem. Either the suttas are wrong or the commentaries are wrong. And in my opinion, it's much more likely that the suttas are right and the commentaries are wrong. And they mainly misunderstand what the Buddha was teaching in the early suttas. So the early suttas obviously had the capacity to start a tradition that lasted for thousands of years, while the commentarial text might still be there today, and they might provide some benefit, otherwise they wouldn't be here. But they are not necessarily the Dhamma. And this is true, by the way, for all major traditions that I know. They might still have value, or they will still have value, but it might not be the Dhamma. And I am personally only interested in the core of the Dhamma, or the hardwood of the Dhamma, and this is what I try to convey with this lecture. And everything else, yeah, you can practice it and try to see for yourself. And if you are honest with yourself, you will probably come to the same conclusion as many other very good monks and people did, or like I also did in this lecture. And I approach the entire thing, the entire teaching, like a scientist. I trace the problem back to the primary sources and start from there. And good scientists pretty much always first read the state of the art and then infer from that. Bad scientists, on the other hand, try to make up some hypothesis and then cherry-pick citations to fit their theories. And this also sadly applies to Buddhism. This is based on what I said before. You do science through your craving. You want your hypothesis to be true, so you cherry pick to make your hypothesis true. This is deeply unscientific and deeply biased. So whenever we say something is biased, then that means that there is greed or aversion involved. We want things to be true or we want things to be false. And based on that, we cannot really understand the truth, which is also what people do in Buddhism. And teachings should be in line with all suttas. We should not cherry-pick suttas to make them fit our theory about jhana or something like that. We should make sure that the explanations about jhana all fit what we practice as jhana. And I first read most of the suttas and generalize from there. And many traditions sadly do the second way, where they make up some theory based on some tradition and then cherry-pick suttas so that they make their method work or in line with the Buddha. And this is often subject to additive errors and probably a big part of the reason why so many traditions nowadays teach jhana in a very different way from what the Buddha did. Because they are disregarding pretty much everything the Buddha said, even though he was very precise. And it's hard to misunderstand it unless you ignore certain key parts of the teachings. And now to an explanation attempt why that might be the case. First of all, the suttas can seem very cryptic without the direct experience or the understanding of Dhamma. The words are just mere pointers to insights, and commentaries seem easier and shorter and with less repetition. So the books that I'm talking about, the Nikayas, those are 10,000 pages with very small font, and most people don't want to read that. So they opt in for books like the Visuddhimagga, which is much shorter and seem much more condensed. And yeah, many translators usually translate books without insights into the Dhamma. And the result can only be very wrong or at least very misleading, which is also something that happens with the Bible quite often. And many times nowadays, being a monk is more of a job or something to calm your mother's worries. So you have to be very careful there. And Eastern teachers, like Ajahn Chah, for example, call their traditions very corrupt. He pretty much said that the entire Dhamma in the East is corrupt. And people like Mahasi Sayadaw also realized that the jhana practices back then were totally not what the Buddha was talking about, and he pretty much said that they should not be practiced. What he replaces them with might not be the best choice nowadays, but the initial observation is very true. The Dhamma back then was not in the best state, and the people even started creating academias where you can learn stream entry and get some certificate for your attainments, which is the opposite of what the Buddha taught. You should not practice to get something. It is about relinquishing and renouncing things, not about getting even more. But anyway, let us now come to the most important point of this chapter. First of all, the ancient Indian culture offered peak conditions for spirituality. Apart from some degeneracy that is always part of a society out of humans, many people were practicing as wandering ascetics. They had great virtue. They tried understanding the nature of all things. There were wandering philosophers of all kinds. And ascetics and monks were revered like star professors nowadays, or star intellectuals like Jordan Peterson or someone like that. And the cultural background does matter, and it is very crucial in understanding similes and presupposed knowledge. Because a lot of the knowledge is presupposed. It is implicit that you know what the Buddha is talking about. He stated the context of every sutta in the beginning, or Ananda, who repeated the suttas at the first Arahant summit, gave us some parts of the background that were deemed as sufficient. They might not be sufficient nowadays, but with a bit of help and understanding you can verify for yourself. And the suttas overall have a lot of repetition as they were transmitted verbally. And the Buddha only taught two things. If you only teach two things in different words, there will be a lot of repetition involved. And people often just heard a single lecture, and that had to be enough. And it was enough oftentimes. If you really understand any single sutta in detail, then you are at least a Sotapanna. And you should not think that you understand a sutta and are a Sotapanna unless you are practically free from suffering. This should be your threshold, not the mapping of some known words in the texts. I mean, yeah, that it could be that you know the words and that they make some sense to you and that you have some kind of understanding of a sutta. But that does not mean that you understood the Dhamma in your experience. Your threshold should always be, how much do I suffer when presented with circumstances that made me suffer in the past? For example, if you are still affected the same way by a breakup or by the death of a loved one, then you are very likely not a stream enterer. This is a very good way of putting it. You should be 99% of the suffering should be gone. And many new traditions and translations are in a stark contradiction with the original suttas. This is something that you should keep in mind. It is very important. If you want to find the hardwood of the Dhamma yourself, you should make sure that it is at least free from contradictions with the suttas, because the suttas do work. This is something very important. But yeah, now we have a meditation of the day. Some of the Mahasi Sayadaw spoken label meditations that you can do for yourself. They can have some merit. Don't get me wrong. Not the entirety of the Mahasi Sayadaw tradition is wrong. They can help you objectify your experience. But the key part is usually not the label meditation. It just helps you stay on task. For people who have great trouble with concentration, they have a mind that is easily lost. So you make the getting lost, in essence, the object of your meditation so that you can find a footing. So it's a very early technique that can have some early benefits for specific kinds of people, but you should be very honest with yourself if such a technique helps you or not. many people nowadays refuse to work with anything else than techniques or methods, which is, I guess it's fine. We have to start somewhere. But at some point, we have to be able to endure the doubt of certain techniques. And this can be a good first step to help you get to know the content of your mind and what is going on, at least at a perspective or at a level of progress where you have no clarity in regard to the perceptions and the feelings and everything else that is happening in the mind. So it can help you find parts of the background of experience. But anyway, you can try it for yourself and see if it benefits you, but you should be self-honest and don't just do it because I don't know, some other people had success with it. What matters is your success with it. Anyway, let us continue. As always, if you have questions, please ask them down below in the comments. I will gather those questions and answer them in a Q&A video at the end so that many people can profit from it. So if you have something that is not entirely clear to you, then feel free to ask and I will try my best to answer those questions. And yeah, as always, a short contact slide. If you want to support me, feel free to do so. If you want to join the Dhamma Hub Discord server, where we are practicing early Buddhism, then feel free to do so. And if you want to look at books on Amazon, also feel free to do so. But yeah, anyway, this is pretty much it for today. And this concludes lecture number 2, where we are talking about the background of the entire Dhamma practice and the physical surroundings of the Buddha, the culture, etc. In the next lecture, we talk about the going forth. Or what makes people choose the Dhamma and what is necessary and what a good character type might be that might succeed in practicing it. But yeah, until then, thank you very much for watching. If you know anyone who would benefit from such a lecture, feel free to recommend it to them. But yeah, until then, I wish you a pleasant day and goodbye.